Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going deep on this report that was recently released by Special Counsel Jack Smith, and it's about all of Donald Trump's efforts to overturn the 2020 election results.
Oh, yeah. This is a big one.
It is. It is. And it's a very unique situation because, of course, Trump was actually indicted, but then the case was dismissed after, he won the 2024 election.
Right. Because of that DOJ policy, you can't prosecute a sitting president.
Right, exactly. And the interesting thing about this is, Smith is basically saying that he thinks he had enough evidence to convict Trump. So that begs the question, would Trump have been found guilty if he hadn't won again?
Yeah, I mean, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It really is. And so we're gonna look at, we've got articles here from the New York Times and the South China Morning Post. We've got Axios. There's a lot here to sort of unpack.
We got a lot to unpack.
We do.
And it's a very complex case, that's for sure. And, I mean, like you said, Jack Smith, he doesn't really mince words, does he?
No, he does not.
In his report, he comes right out and says, but for Mr. Trump's election and imminent return to the presidency, the office assessed that the admissible evidence was sufficient to obtain and sustain a conviction at trial.
Wow.
So he's basically saying we had him.
Yeah. I mean, that's a very bold statement.
Yeah.
I mean, he's saying he had a rock-solid case.
Absolutely.
And this wasn't just, a hunch or anything. They conducted over 250 interviews. They got testimony from over 55 witnesses through a grand jury, and they had just mountains of evidence. So they were not messing around.
No, this was a very, very thorough investigation.
It was.
And one of the things that's really compelling, I think, is the testimony from Brad Raffensperger.
Oh, right, the Georgia Secretary of
His
State.
infamous phone call.
Yeah, the phone call.
Yeah, and the report goes into detail about, how Trump was pressuring Raffensperger to find enough votes to overturn Biden's win in Georgia.
Oh, wow.
And he even said, and I quote, "All I want to do is this. I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have."
Wow. That's pretty damning. I mean, he's asking a state official to manipulate the vote count.
That's right, and it wasn't an isolated incident either. The report outlines a pattern of Trump pressuring officials in other states as well.
So this whole unprecedented criminal effort that Smith keeps referring to, what exactly did it entail?
Well, like we see with the Raffensperger call, pressuring state officials was a major part of it.
Bro.
But it went further than that, right? So Trump's team also tried to assemble alternate slates of electors in key states.
Hold on. How is that even possible? Don't electors have to follow the popular vote in their state?
Right, they're supposed to. But Trump's team argued that there were enough irregularities in the election to justify these alternate slates.
So they were trying to exploit legal loopholes to overturn the results?
You could say that. And this legal maneuvering, this is part of what makes this case so complex.
Okay, so we've got the pressure on state officials. We've got this fake elector scheme. What else?
Well, there's one more big piece to this.
Oh, right. What about, didn't Smith also say something about Trump inciting the January 6th riot?
He did.
Okay.
And this is where, legally speaking, things get really interesting.
Okay.
The report argues that Trump's rhetoric, specifically his claims of a stolen election and his calls for supporters to fight like hell, directly contributed to the violence at the Capitol.
But didn't Trump also tell his supporters to march peacefully to the Capitol? I mean, I remember seeing clips of that speech.
He did say that. But the report contends that this one statement doesn't negate the broader context of his speech, which, let's be honest, was filled with inflammatory language and baseless accusations of fraud.
So Smith is arguing that Trump's words had a direct impact on the actions of the rioters. I mean, that's a pretty tough argument to make, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And I imagine this would have been a major point of contention had the case gone to trial. The defense would have likely argued that Trump's speech was protected under the First Amendment.
Right. But, I mean, you have to admit the timing is pretty suspicious. I mean, Trump gives this fiery speech about a stolen election, and then hours later, his supporters are storming the Capitol.
It doesn't look good.
It's not a good one.
No, it's not. And the report goes into great detail about the impact of that day on the Capitol police officers who were defending the building. The physical and psychological trauma that these officers endured, it's heartbreaking.
Yeah, it really is a stark reminder of the human cost of that day.
Absolutely.
And it makes you wonder, even if Trump didn't explicitly tell his supporters to attack the Capitol, does he bear any responsibility for what happened?
That's the question, isn't it? And it's one that Smith clearly believes should have been answered in a court of law.
Yeah. Yeah. And to Trump's credit, I mean, he's always been pretty vocal about how this entire investigation was just a witch hunt orchestrated by the Democrats.
Yeah, of course, Trump has his own perspective on this. Right?
Sure.
He's consistently denied any wrongdoing and claims that the DOJ is biased against him. And to be fair to our listeners, I mean, it's important to remember that we are presenting the information from Smith's report and other sources, but ultimately you can draw your own conclusions.
Absolutely. Yeah. We're not here to tell anyone what to think, just to lay out the facts
Yeah.
and different perspectives as best we can.
That's right.
But let's get back to, Smith and his investigation.
Okay.
I mean, he was pretty adamant that this was not a politically motivated investigation.
He was. He addresses it directly in the report.
And does he?
Yeah, he states, "The claim from Mr. Trump that my decisions as a prosecutor were influenced or directed by the Biden administration or other political actors is, in a word, laughable."
Oh, wow. So he's pushing back pretty hard against those accusations of bias. But, I mean, is that just him trying to cover his own back? Is it possible that he was pressured by the Biden administration to go after Trump?
I mean, it's possible, sure, but we have no evidence to support that claim.
Right.
And it's worth noting that Smith was appointed by Trump himself back in 2017.
That's right. He was originally brought in to investigate Russian interference in the 2016 election.
Exactly. So it's not like he's some partisan Democrat out to get him.
Right, right. But what do legal experts have to say about all this? I mean, do they think that Smith had a strong enough case to convict Trump?
Well, opinions are divided, as you might expect.
Yeah.
But there are some very prominent legal voices who believe a conviction was likely.
Really?
Yeah. Ty Cobb, who served as White House counsel under Trump, even said, yes, he would have been convicted. He had no defenses.
Wow. That's a pretty bold statement coming from someone who actually worked for Trump.
It is. It is. But, it's important to remember that even if the evidence seems strong, there's no guarantee of a conviction in our justice system. I mean, a trial would have allowed Trump to present his own defense and try to sway a jury. And of course, there's the elephant in the room.
The DOJ policy against prosecuting a sitting president.
Exactly. That policy is ultimately what shielded Trump from facing trial.
Which leads to a whole other set of questions. I mean, how can we hold a president accountable if they can potentially avoid prosecution by winning re-election?
That's a big question, isn't it? It seems like a pretty big flaw in the system.
It does, yeah.
It does raise some serious concerns about accountability and the rule of law. But before we get into that, let's maybe unpack the DOJ policy itself a little bit more, because it's not some clearly defined rule. It's more of a tradition based on this idea that indicting a sitting president would be just too disruptive.
Too disruptive.
Yeah, and that it could potentially paralyze the executive branch.
I see.
But is that a valid argument? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and one that I think we should explore in more depth on the next part of our deep dive.
We should, absolutely.
But for now, let's take a quick step back and reflect on what we've learned so far. What strikes you as the most significant aspect of Smith's findings? Is it the pressure on state officials? Is it the attempt to create fake electors? Is it the connection to January 6th? Or is it something else entirely?
There's a lot to think about, that's for sure.
There is, and we've only just scratched the surface.
We have, but that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating, right?
Right.
We're peeling back the layers of this complex case, revealing the evidence, the legal arguments, and the implications for our democracy.
I completely agree. And we'll be back in just a moment to continue our exploration.
That's good.
Okay, so we're back and ready to kind of dig a little deeper into this DOJ policy that we're talking about that ultimately let Trump off the hook.
Right.
You were explaining a little bit of the reasoning behind it before we left off.
Yeah, the DOJ's policy against indicting a sitting president.
Right.
The idea being that it would be too disruptive, that it could paralyze the executive branch.
Right.
But as you pointed out, it also creates this scenario where a president could use their position to avoid consequences.
It's a double-edged sword. Right.
It is. It is.
You're protecting the presidency, but also potentially shielding someone from being held accountable.
Right.
Has this policy ever been challenged before?
Not successfully. It's been a long-standing practice, although, it's never actually been codified into law.
Really?
Yeah. There have been instances where presidents have been investigated while in office.
Like Nixon?
Nixon, Clinton.
Right.
But no sitting president has ever been indicted.
So it's more of a tradition or a norm than an actual rule.
Exactly.
Okay. But, I mean, that doesn't make it any less potent, right?
No, not at all.
In this case, it was enough to get the charges against Trump dropped.
Right.
Which begs the question, is this policy truly serving the best interests of justice?
Yeah, it's a tough question.
It is. It is a
Oh.
tough question. I mean, on one hand, you don't want to have this situation where a president is constantly bogged down by legal battles and things.
Right.
But on the other hand, I mean, no one is above the law, right?
Right.
Not even the president.
It's a delicate balance.
It is.
And Smith's report really throws this dilemma into sharp relief. It's almost as if he's challenging the DOJ to re-examine this policy,
Yeah.
to consider the implications.
So what happens now? I mean, the case is closed. Trump is back in office. Does this report have any real-world impact?
That's a great question. Legally speaking, you're right.
Yeah.
The case is over.
Yeah.
But politically, I think this report could have lasting consequences.
Huh.
I mean, it lays out a very compelling case against Trump,
Right.
and that's not something that just goes away easily.
Like, could it lead to impeachment proceedings?
It's possible, but, impeachment is ultimately a political process. Yeah.
And it's hard to say if there's enough support in Congress to actually move forward with that.
Yeah. What about public opinion? Could this report sway people's views on Trump?
It could. The report's findings are pretty damning,
Yeah.
and they could definitely erode public trust in Trump.
Okay.
But you have to remember, Trump has a very loyal base of supporters.
Yeah.
They may not be swayed by this report.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine them changing their minds after all this.
It is.
But maybe, just maybe, this report plants a seed of doubt.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
And even if it doesn't change minds, it could energize those who are already critical of Trump.
Okay.
It could lead to renewed calls for reforms within the DOJ.
Oh, interesting.
Maybe even a constitutional amendment to clarify the rules around prosecuting a sitting president.
Now, that would be a major shakeup.
It would. It would.
But honestly, I mean, after everything we've learned about this case, it doesn't seem that far-fetched. No, not at all. This
Yeah.
whole situation has really exposed some serious vulnerabilities in our system. I mean, it's a wake-up call.
Yeah.
And, it's not just about Trump, right?
Right.
It's about ensuring that no president, regardless of party, can abuse their power and evade accountability.
So what you're saying is even though the legal battle is over, the fight for accountability and the rule of law continues.
Absolutely. This report isn't the end of the story.
Okay.
It's just another chapter.
Great.
And as we look ahead, it's important to consider the broader implications. How do we prevent something like this from happening again?
Right.
How do we strengthen our democratic institutions and safeguard against future abuses of power?
Yeah, those are some weighty questions.
They are.
It feels like we're wading into uncharted territory here.
We are in many ways. And
Well-
that's what makes this such a fascinating, albeit unsettling moment in our history,
Yeah.
We're witnessing this clash between the power of the presidency and the principles of justice, and the outcome is far from certain.
It's almost like we're watching a legal drama unfold in real time,
Is.
except the stakes are much higher.
They are. The consequences are very real. And that's why it's so important to stay informed, to engage in these conversations, and to hold our leaders accountable.
Yeah. Before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, you mentioned earlier that there's a second volume to Smith's report
Right.
focusing on the classified documents case against Trump.
Right.
What can you tell us about that?
Well, it's still under wraps,
Okay.
because of the ongoing legal proceedings against some of Trump's aides
I see.
who were charged as co-conspirators in that case.
Okay.
But I suspect it will be just as revealing as the first volume, if not more so.
Okay.
The classified documents case really raises serious questions about national security, the handling of sensitive information.
Yeah, it sounds like a whole other can of worms.
It is.
I'm definitely curious to see how Smith connects the dots in that case.
Yeah, me too.
I have a feeling we'll be back here dissecting that report before too long.
I'm sure we will.
Hopefully we don't have to wait too long for that second volume to be released. But until then, I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about.
We have.
This whole situation with the DOJ policy and the potential implications for future presidents, I mean, it's pretty mind-boggling.
It is. It really raises some fundamental questions about, the nature of power, accountability, and the very foundations of our democracy.
All right, well, we are going to take another quick break, but when we come back, we'll wrap up our deep dive into Smith's report with some final thoughts. And of course, we'll leave our listeners with a few questions to ponder on their own. See you in a few. Okay, so we're back. And I think, we've really taken a deep dive into this Jack Smith report, haven't we?
We have.
We covered a lot of ground. The evidence that he gathered, those legal strategies that Trump allegedly used, that whole debate about the DOJ policy on prosecuting presidents, it's a lot to unpack.
It really is. And I think, as we're trying to synthesize all of this, it's important to remember that this isn't just, a historical analysis.
Right.
I mean, these events have real-world consequences that we're still grappling with.
Absolutely. You're right. This isn't just some abstract legal case. This is about the foundation of our democracy.
It is.
The peaceful transfer of power, faith in our elections. I mean, these aren't just, talking points.
Right.
These things are vital.
They are. They're vital for a functioning society.
They are.
And that's what makes Smith's report so significant, even if it didn't result in an actual trial.
Right.
It lays bare just how fragile our institutions are.
Yeah.
And how easily they can be manipulated.
Yeah. So even though the case is closed, the conversation, I think, needs to continue.
It does.
We have to ask ourselves, what safeguards can we put in place to prevent something like this from happening again?
Yeah, and maybe even more importantly, what does this whole situation tell us about, the kind of leaders that we choose?
Right.
Are we prioritizing charisma and power over integrity and a respect for the rule of law?
Yeah.
Those are questions that I think each of us needs to wrestle with.
It's almost like, this report is a mirror, reflecting back not just on Trump's actions, but on ourselves as a society.
Yeah.
What do we value? What are we willing to tolerate?
Those are tough questions.
They are.
But crucial ones. And remember, we're still waiting on that second volume of Smith's report.
That's right.
The one that deals with the classified documents case.
Yeah, who knows what revelations that will bring. Yeah, there's potentially another layer to this whole saga that we're going to have to, wait and see what happens. We'll definitely be diving into that report as soon as it's made available to the public.
Yeah.
But for now, I think let's leave our listeners with, just a final thought to kind of ponder.
Sounds good.
We know that the case against Trump was dismissed, but after learning about the evidence presented in Smith's report, does it change your perception of what happened in the 2020 election?
It's not really about, changing anyone's mind. It's about encouraging, critical thinking. Take the information we've talked about today, do your own research, and come to your own conclusion.
Absolutely. And that's really what these deep dives are all about, right?
Yeah.
We're equipping our listeners with the knowledge, the context to understand the complexities of the world around them.
Exactly.
And we'll have links to all the sources that we use today down in the show notes so you can, dig in even deeper if you like.
Knowledge is power, as they say.
It is.
And in a world just overflowing with information, it's more important than ever to be discerning, to question, and to think for yourself.
I couldn't agree more. Well, thanks for joining us on this journey into, the heart of Smith's report. It's been, illuminating to say the least. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a new topic. Until then, stay curious, everybody.
Thanks for listening.